1960, Los Angeles. A private room behind closed doors. No press, no witnesses. Just three men who think they control the moment, and one who already knows the moment is controlling them. Peter Lawford speaks about a future president as if the deal is done, as if the Rat Pack isn't a group of performers anymore, but a tool, a symbol, something to be pointed, aimed, and used. Frank Sinatra listens closely, too closely. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't joke. For the first time, he hears history calling his name, and he likes the sound of it. Dean Martin says nothing. He doesn't smile. He doesn't drink. He watches how carefully the words are chosen, how power is mentioned without being named, how the room fills with something heavier than ambition. Dean understands something the others don't yet. Once the stage turns into a platform, there's no clean way back, no applause loud enough to cover the consequences. He won't raise his voice. He won't stop the evening. But in a few minutes, he will pull Sinatra aside for a quiet conversation, one with no witnesses and no way to undo. And after that night, the Rat Pack will still exist in name. But it will never be the same again. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The invitation arrived without ceremony. No embossed seal, no assistant on the line selling importance. Just a quiet call, late afternoon, asking if Dean could make it to Beverly Hills that night. Peter Lawford's house, small dinner, no press, no managers. Just us, the voice said, as if that explained everything. The house itself did the rest. Set back from the road, too private to feel friendly. Lit in a way that made the marble floors gleam, but swallowed the corners in shadow. The kind of place built to impress, without ever needing to announce it. Staff moved silently. Glassware was already laid out. Everything suggested control. Money arranged to look effortless. Frank Sinatra arrived first, already energized, already talking. His voice filled the room the way it always did, confident, buoyant, riding the belief that the moment belonged to him. Sammy followed, joking, smoothing the edges. Laughter came easily, almost on reflex. That was how these evenings usually went. Dean came last. He didn't comment on the house, didn't reach for a drink. He listened. Lawford waited until plates were cleared before speaking in earnest. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, not out of secrecy, but expectation. He talked about the country, about change, about how America was shedding an old skin. Then he said it plainly. This wasn't just about music anymore. This was about being seen, about shaping something larger than careers. He mentioned the Kennedys without ceremony, as if everyone already understood the weight of the name. He spoke of doors that didn't open for most people, of rooms where decisions were made before headlines ever caught up. He didn't promise anything outright, but he didn't need to. The implication hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating. Sinatra leaned back, smiling. Not the stage smile, but the one that came when he sensed history tilting in his direction. He asked questions, smart ones, curious ones. He saw the scale immediately. This wasn't another benefit concert. This was alignment, legacy. Dean watched Lawford's hands instead of his face. The careful way he framed sentences, the pauses, the confidence of someone used to being believed. When the word coordination surfaced, just once, Dean felt it land like a stone. When Lawford suggested that future appearances might benefit from being in sync with friends in Washington, the room stayed quiet, a beat too long. Someone joked about having the right friends in the right places. A light laugh, nothing sharp. Dean shifted then, smoothly, redirecting the conversation to music, to touring schedules, to anything that would loosen the tension without exposing it. The evening survived because he made it survive. By the time coats were collected, the energy had changed. Sinatra was already talking about possibilities. Lawford looked satisfied. Plans were forming, whether spoken or not. Dean declined the ride back. He stepped out alone into the cool California night, the house glowing behind him like a sealed promise. He stood for a moment longer than necessary, hands in his pockets, feeling the weight of something he hadn't agreed to, but hadn't refused either. For the first time in years, he didn't know where the stage ended and something else began. And that uncertainty stayed with him long after the lights disappeared behind the hills. The shift didn't announce itself. No manifesto, no banner unfurled behind the band. To the audience, the shows felt the same. Sharp suits, loose timing, jokes that landed just late enough to feel dangerous. But on stage, something had changed, and they all felt it. It started with asides. Sinatra would slip a name into the rhythm of the night, lightly, like a wink shared with the room. A reference to new blood in Washington. A line about youth, about vigor, about a country finally catching up with itself. The crowd laughed because it sounded like texture, not intent. Politics wrapped in charm didn't register as politics at all. Backstage, Lawford began to appear more often. Not during rehearsals, never during the actual performance. Always after. He brought suggestions framed as favors, messages delivered casually, as if he were only passing along what friends had mentioned in passing. Could Frank emphasize unity a little more tonight? Would it help to avoid certain jokes in Chicago? Nothing written down. Nothing that could be pointed to later. Journalists noticed before fans did. The questions shifted. Fewer inquiries about arrangements and set lists, more about influence, about responsibility, about whether entertainers had a duty beyond applause. Sinatra answered smoothly. He enjoyed the attention. It made the work feel consequential. Dean answered less and less. One night, after a show that ran longer than planned, a man Dean didn't recognize lingered near the wings. He wasn't staff, didn't introduce himself, just nodded once and disappeared with one of the recording engineers. Later, Dean learned that parts of the set had been taped separately. Not for broadcast, not for archives. The explanation, when it came, was vague and unsatisfying. A manager pulled Dean aside days later. Quiet voice. No panic, just experience. He warned him that politics didn't play by the same rules as show business. Mistakes didn't fade. They compounded. And exits, once missed, didn't reopen. The pressure was subtle, but constant. Every yes created expectation. Every absence raised questions. When an invitation arrived for a high-profile event framed as important, Dean declined. No excuse offered. He simply said he wouldn't be there. The room went still when the message was delivered. Sinatra took it personally. Not publicly, not yet. But Dean could feel it in the way conversations shortened, in how plans were discussed around him instead of with him. The group moved as a unit, and his stillness disrupted the rhythm. On stage, humor had become a tool. Not release, but leverage. Lines were chosen for effect beyond laughter. Dean felt the difference every time he stepped into the light. The freedom he'd built his career on was narrowing, slowly, almost politely. Everyone else seemed relieved to have direction, to be wanted. Dean wasn't sure when entertainment stopped being the point. He only knew that once the stage became a platform, stepping back wasn't neutrality. It was resistance. And resistance, he understood, came with a price no one else seemed ready to pay. The corridor behind the stage smelled of hot cables and stale smoke. Applause still bled through the walls in uneven waves, But back here, the night was already winding down. Jackets were being pulled on, voices dropping, the adrenaline thinning into fatigue. Dean waited until most of them drifted away before he touched Sinatra's arm. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Frank followed without comment, irritation flickering briefly before curiosity took over. They moved past dressing rooms, past a mirror cracked at the corner, until the noise softened into a dull hum. Dean stopped near a service door that led nowhere important. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lean in. He spoke the way he always did when something mattered, calm enough to sound almost casual. "This is getting bigger than you think." Sinatra exhaled sharply, half a laugh. He started to reply, but Dean lifted a hand, just enough to pause him. "I'm not talking about Kennedy," Dean continued, "or Lawford. I'm talking about the people who don't clap, the ones who don't show up front. They're listening now." Frank's expression tightened. He crossed his arms, defensive, impatient. He said Dean was being paranoid, that nothing moved without him knowing, that he'd been in tougher rooms than this. Dean nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact rather than agreeing. "That's what worries me." He told Frank that certain names were being mentioned in conversations he wasn't part of, that favors had begun to stack without anyone keeping count, that once expectations formed, refusal would no longer be an option. It would be an insult. He didn't accuse. He didn't dramatize. He laid it out like weather, inevitable and indifferent. "You think you're steering this," Dean said quietly, "but it's already steering you." That landed harder than anything else. Sinatra's jaw set. Pride flared. He shot back that Dean had always preferred standing on the edge. That caution was just another way of avoiding commitment. The words were sharp enough to leave a mark. Dean absorbed them without reaction. He'd expected worse. "I'm saying this once," he replied. "Not because I'm right, because if I am, there won't be a second chance to say it." For a moment, neither spoke. The muffled laughter from another hallway echoed faintly, out of place, almost cruel. Sinatra looked away first. When he spoke again, his tone had changed, not softer, but colder. "If you don't want to be part of it," he said, "that's your choice." Dean understood what that meant. Lines were being drawn, quietly, efficiently. He nodded, stepped back, and opened the service door. Cool air rushed in, carrying the city with it. They didn't shake hands. They didn't argue further. There was nothing left to resolve. As Dean walked away, he felt the weight settle. Not relief, not regret, but responsibility. He had said what needed saying. What came next would happen, whether he watched or not. Behind him, Sinatra stood alone in the corridor, applause finally fading into silence, facing a future he was no longer sure he controlled. The night of the election ended in noise. Radios blared from open windows, champagne corks cracked against ceilings, and strangers embraced as if history itself had leaned down to shake their hands. Victory had a sound, and for weeks afterward, it echoed everywhere Sinatra went. He wore it easily. He had helped put rhythm to a movement, voice to a promise. He expected the next step to follow naturally. It didn't. The first weeks passed without comment. Then a month. Invitations arrived from everywhere except the place that mattered. Dinners, galas, private parties dressed up as gratitude. Each one felt like a substitute offered too quickly. Sinatra waited for something official, something unmistakable. The explanation came indirectly. A careful phone call, polite words, concerns about optics, about security, about appearances that might complicate a young administration eager to look clean. No accusation was made, but none was needed. Certain associations were suddenly inconvenient. Lawford tried to soften it. He spoke of timing, of protocols still settling, of how these things required patience. But the confidence was gone. His sentences now circled instead of advancing. He no longer spoke as someone inside the room, only adjacent to it. Dean noticed before anyone else did. Not because he was smarter, because he was listening differently. He watched how quickly doors closed once their usefulness ended, how gratitude evaporated the moment it risked exposure. He said nothing. Sinatra learned the truth in fragments, a remark overheard at a dinner, a favor quietly withdrawn. The realization didn't ignite anger, it hollowed him out. He had given something real, something public, and the return was distance disguised as decorum. The final confirmation arrived without drama. A formal event at the White House. Names published. His absent. No call followed. No apology. Just the understanding that whatever had been promised was never meant to be delivered. Lawford stopped pressing. He couldn't. His own access had been overstated, his influence borrowed, rather than owned. When he spoke now, it was to explain limits he hadn't admitted existed. Dean watched Sinatra process it in silence. There was no satisfaction in being right, only the dull recognition of a pattern he'd seen before. Power used people the way crowds used songs, until the sound faded. The illusion cracked not with force, but with indifference. That was the cruelty of it. Nothing had gone wrong. Everything had worked exactly as intended. Dean didn't say, "I warned you." He didn't offer comfort either. Some lessons couldn't be softened without losing their truth. He simply adjusted his own course, quietly, decisively. The victory everyone celebrated had already passed its expiration date, and the cost of believing otherwise was only just beginning to settle in. The break didn't arrive with an argument. There was no slammed door, no raised voice to mark the moment. What changed was quieter, more permanent. Decisions began to diverge, and once they did, there was no clean way back. Sinatra carried the disappointment differently now. It settled into him, sharpened his edges. The sense of having been used didn't turn him inward. It made him restless. He spoke less about the future and more about loyalty, about who stood where when it mattered. Not accusations, observations, the kind that stayed in the air long after the conversation moved on. Lawford faded from the center almost without noticing it himself. He still showed up, still smiled, still spoke as if connections were intact. But the calls he made weren't returned with the same urgency. Explanations replaced assurances. He avoided long conversations, especially with Dean, as though silence might preserve what clarity would destroy. Dean stepped back deliberately. Not abruptly enough to invite questions, not loudly enough to demand interpretation. He declined appearances that would have restored his standing instantly. Offers came, well-meaning, strategic, tempting. All he had to do was align himself publicly, speak once, be seen once. He refused each time, politely, consistently. The cost was immediate. Whispers followed, suggestions that he was difficult, unreliable, afraid. He didn't correct any of it. What no one saw were the quiet adjustments he made behind the scenes, calls placed late at night, schedules altered, financial obligations absorbed without discussion, risks redistributed so they landed on him instead of spreading outward. He didn't announce it. He didn't expect thanks. It was simply cleaner that way. One of Sinatra's closest associates would admit years later that certain stories never reached the papers because Dean stopped them cold, without confrontation, without leaving fingerprints, not out of loyalty to the image, but to the people who would have been crushed publicly if things unraveled all at once. Dean grew tired. Not the kind rest could fix. The exhaustion of carrying weight no one acknowledged, of being misunderstood by design. He didn't frame it as sacrifice. He didn't frame it at all. He just kept choosing the quieter path, even as it narrowed his own. The group still existed in name, still shared history. But the center was gone. What held them together now was habit, not purpose. And habit, once questioned, didn't survive long. Dean understood that by staying silent, he was shaping the ending whether anyone recognized it or not. He would lose standing. He would lose clarity in the public eye. But something worse would be avoided. Sometimes protection didn't look like leadership. Sometimes it looked like retreat. And Dean accepted that cost without asking anyone else to understand it. By early 1962, the illusion was maintained out of habit, more than hope. On paper, nothing had ended. There were no statements, no public fractures to dissect. The name still carried weight. Posters still used it. But the machinery that once kept everything moving in sync had gone quiet. Sinatra stopped calling Lawford first. Then he stopped calling at all. Invitations that once came automatically were suddenly complicated. Dates filled without explanation. When Lawford did appear, it was briefly, awkwardly, like a man who had arrived after the reason for the gathering had passed. No one confronted him. No one needed to. Absence did the work efficiently. Lawford felt it before he admitted it. Not anger, confusion. He replayed conversations, searched for the moment things tipped. There wasn't one. What he'd lost wasn't influence, but trust. And trust didn't announce its departure. It simply failed to show up when called. Sinatra knew the truth, but resisted saying it aloud. Acknowledging the mistake meant owning it, and ownership came with consequences he wasn't ready to face. He confided once, late at night, that he'd believed proximity to power meant control. Saying it out loud stripped the idea of its last defense. He didn't try to undo it. He couldn't. Dean stayed deliberately unreachable. Not cold, precise. He answered when necessary, declined when it mattered, and never positioned himself between the two men who now avoided each other. More than once, someone suggested he intervene. He refused every time. Mediation would have turned the fracture into a spectacle. Silence kept it contained. What unraveled did so quietly. A missing chair at dinner. A name left off a guest list. A phone call that ended without plans being made. The tragedy wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Lawford finally understood that nothing he said would restore what had been lost. His access had been conditional, and the condition no longer applied. He didn't fight it. There was nothing left to argue against. Dean watched it conclude without relief. This wasn't vindication. It was confirmation. The ending he'd tried to prevent had simply chosen a quieter route. He receded further, not out of guilt, but to prevent aftershocks. The less he was seen, the less there was to explain. By the time anyone noticed the Rat Pack had effectively dissolved, it had already been over for months. What remained were careers, memories, and the unspoken understanding that something human had been traded for proximity to power. No one announced the end. There was no need. Some breakups don't happen in public. They happen in the space where calls stop being returned, and no one asks why. By the late 1970s, the nights were quieter. Not lonely, just settled. Dean preferred them that way. No entourage, no schedule carved into stone. A small table near the back of a familiar room. The kind of place where no one rushed him and no one expected a performance. A man sat across from him, someone he'd known a long time. Not a reporter exactly. More like a witness who'd waited long enough to ask. The question came carefully, almost apologetically, framed as curiosity rather than challenge. People were still arguing about those years, he said, still assigning blame, still asking why Dean had stepped away when everything seemed within reach. Dean listened without interrupting. His face didn't change. When the question finished, he didn't answer right away. He looked past the table, toward the bar, toward nothing in particular. Then he shrugged, slight, economical. "It wasn't my story to tell," he said. The man pressed gently. History had been written without him, he pointed out. Versions had hardened. Dean could correct them now, clear the air, restore his place in it. Dean smiled, but it wasn't amusement. "Someone would have paid for that," he replied, "and it wouldn't have been me." That was as close as he came to explanation. He didn't name names, didn't list consequences, but it was clear he'd understood the math long before anyone else. He could have spoken. He could have redirected blame, preserved standing, reshaped perception. The cost would have landed elsewhere, publicly, permanently. He'd chosen not to. The man finally understood that silence hadn't been avoidance. It had been a decision made with full awareness of what it would erase. Dean hadn't protected an image. He'd protected people who never would have survived the truth intact. There was no pride in the admission, no bitterness either. Just acceptance. Dean finished his drink, nodded once, and let the conversation drift to safer ground. Later, walking out alone, he moved at the same unhurried pace he always had. His life hadn't narrowed after stepping away. It had clarified. The noise had left. What remained was choice. He hadn't won. He hadn't lost. He'd weighed what mattered against what glittered and acted accordingly. History would never fully reward that. It wasn't designed to. But some decisions weren't meant to be applauded. They were meant to be carried. And Dean had carried his quietly, all the way to the end.